When you think of holiness, what comes to mind? Christmas carols, Gregorian chant style hymns, or do you actually think it's something that you just can't quite grasp? Something that's just a little bit above you because, for lack of a better term, it's above your pay grade. Holiness was never meant to be something that we don't understand. Holiness is actually meant to be something that we are as the people of God. But what does it even mean? What does holy mean? Holy means to be clean, pure, undefiled, uncommon, set apart, a cut above. And we see throughout the Old Testament just what can be holy and just what it means to be holy. The very first instance we see of the word holy comes from the book of Genesis, where God actually declares time, the Sabbath, to be holy. The second instance of the word holy is when Moses encounters God at the burning bush, and he tells him to take off his sandals because you're on holy ground. We actually see that God is the one who declares what is holy and what isn't. He gets to set the boundaries of what is and is not holy, because as the rest of the Old Testament shows us, God himself, in his character, is holy. He is set apart, a cut above, clean, pure, undefiled, and uncommon. Now, one of the things that we miss out on is the book of Leviticus. We tend to look at it in our Bible reading plans and go, okay, how can I skip this? How can I just skim through it? It's a book of rules and laws and regulations. But really what Leviticus is talking about holiness. How can God's people, individually and as the totality of his people, be holy? How can an unclean people be clean so that they can enter into God's presence and he can actually dwell among them? Because, be clear, God tells us in Leviticus that if something impure, something unclean, something common, enters into his presence, it will be obliterated. So all Leviticus is doing is actually showing us how to be holy. Because if you take something that is unclean, like this dirty water, and you add it to clean water, what are you going to wind up with? More dirty water. The uncleanness of sin actually contaminates the cleanness that we need, the holiness that we need to dwell in God's presence. Now, what Leviticus does is it gives the rules and regulations to actually take something that's unclean, and if we were to strain it through this shirt, Bear Grylls style, would come out, well, in the case of our illustration, relatively clean, but as you can see, there's too much sand in this, so we're not going to attempt that part of the illustration. But that's what Leviticus is showing us. How can we, or how could Israel, individually and collectively, be made clean, be made pure, so that they could actually be in the presence of a holy God? So throughout most of the Old Testament, that's what we see. This system of going from unclean, keeping the law and the regulations and the sacrifices, to actually be clean. But in Isaiah 6, we see a significant sea change. Isaiah has a vision of God in the totality of his holiness. He sees the seraphim flying around. They're crying, holy, holy, holy. I love the way R.C. Sproul puts it in The Pursuit of Holiness. It's like they're flying around singing, a cut above, a cut above, a cut above. And Isaiah realizes in that moment, as he sees the full holiness of God, woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips. He knows that it just doesn't matter. Despite all the straining through the t-shirt, he still looks like this. But God sends one of the seraphim to fly to him with a coal from the altar, and he touches it to his lips, and he says, your guilt is forgiven and your sins are atoned for. And we see a sudden and dramatic shift, where we go from what is nasty and unclean, needing to go through these steps to be made clean, to God, the one who declared the Sabbath to be holy, the one who declared the ground Moses stood on to be holy, actually declaring someone who is unclean to be holy. We don't see uncleanness taking something clean and making it dirty. We actually see something clean making something dirty clean. That sounds really redundant, but that's what's going on. We even see the clash of these two ideas later on when we get to the book of Haggai, where he actually ends up quizzing the priest and saying, hey, if something unclean touches something clean, what happens? And they go, well, the clean thing becomes unclean. Right? Makes sense. But that seed has been planted in Isaiah that maybe, just maybe, there's a different way. That just maybe something dirty can actually be made clean, not through sacrifice, not through law, but by God himself. And that's what we see in the person of Jesus. When Jesus comes, he is God in the flesh. He is holiness personified. And he goes out and he does things that would make any normal human unclean according to the law. But instead he makes the unclean clean. He touches the sick and they're healed. He touches the dead and they're raised. Things that should have made him unclean and made him actually an outcast in the eyes of his own people. Instead, he cleanses it. What we see in Jesus is that God doesn't necessarily have to obliterate uncleanness. He can actually declare it to be clean. And when Jesus dies on the cross, when he dies the death that we deserve to die, he is the atoning sacrifice. He is the removal of sins. He's the coal on Isaiah's lips. It's his death, it's his sacrifice that perfectly covers, that perfectly strains out the impurity, the uncleanness, and makes us individually and collectively as God's people holy in God's sight. After all, we're supposed to be holy as God is holy. The only way we can be that is for God himself to declare us to be clean. And he does that through the holy and perfect sacrifice of Jesus on the cross on our behalf. That is what holiness is, to be pure and set apart, so that you can be in God's presence, that you can be in relationship with him. It is to go from being unclean to clean.